If the computer audio doesn't work live, I apologize, but I have to stick to the in-house lecture. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of a history of economic thought, but focusing on growth. And then we're going to look at the controversial issues now. I was asked before if there is a policy message on how to save the world. The answer is no. There is no policy message how to save the world, even if there is a message in the lack of message, which is don't believe in the message and shoot the messenger. Whoever will come and tell you they have the solution to make you rich and create growth and do miracles, don't believe in them. They're trying to trick you. There's some Dr. Dulcamara, which I hope you've learned who he was. Donizetti was from around here, right? Am I wrong? Wasn't it? No? Donizetti. I think he was from, well, whatever. Okay, so what I will do is to mix theory, history, and also some reference to data and policy. It's going to be a broad picture. I mean, we have an hour. Well, by the way, I didn't ask how much time, so I assume the usual academic time. Until 7. Oh, well, an hour and a half. And I will take a historical perspective because I think a historical perspective helps a lot in understanding what we think. What are the things you want to take away from this conversation? The first thing you want to keep in mind is that historically, innovation has been very slow and accumulation of factors of production, capital, animals, land, human, was the thing. It was the very visible thing for thousands of years. Take a long-run perspective about human. Don't start in 1977, okay? Just look a bit beyond, and you will notice that for most of the time, becoming rich meant to have stuff, right? Cows, horses, land, pigs, women. Yeah, women too. Sorry to inform you, but used to be treated as property. Eggs, grains, salami, all that. Many houses, the castle, right? That was the idea. So you accumulate. That was, nobody paid a lot of attention to innovation 1,000 years ago. The innovation, if it was paid attention to, was warfare innovation. For this, actually, I recommend a wonderful book, The Pursuit of Power by Bill McNeill. It's a fantastic book everybody should read, which essentially looks at the last 1,000 years or so, 1,200 years of political military history, both in Asia and here. It makes very clear how for an extremely long time, the key thing was military innovation, not much more than that, okay? Why do I insist on this? I insist on this because you understand when economics started to become economics, okay, roughly, there were some guys that thought about it here in Italy in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, but nobody paid much attention to Galliani or Davanzati and so on. Only some very sophisticated intellectuals know about them. The economists everybody think about are the physiocrats, right? Turgot and company, and then the Scottish, obviously, Smith, and then the other British. And they tried to take a look at the process of how nations became wealthy or not by looking at what had happened. And what had happened until then, mostly, was accumulation, which was funny because they were actually living in the middle of a process of incredible innovation, institutional, scientific, in trade practice, and so on. But it was too short. And often we don't see what's happening when we are alive, right? Things are happening around us and we don't see the pattern. We see the pattern much better when we look backward. And so, as you will see, the classical economists just thought about growth as a process of accumulation. And this point of view, in some sense, define economic research, at least at the macro level, for a long time. This started in the 18th century, but the whole 19th century and most of the 20th was concentrated on that. In fact, I'm sure the more, as we will see later, I understand most of the students here are doing economics, right? The models they probably still teach you, and it's not the fault of your professor, that's what there is, are models in which there is capital accumulation, right? And that's it, right? Okay. Then we get to the little controversial thing. Look at that. Okay? It still does, I wrote there somewhat polemically. When you advocate demand to stimulate growth, you think like you were in the 19th century, right? Because if you don't see that the key factor, the key driver for growth is actually changing the way you do things, because that's what innovation is. It's just changing the way you do things, possibly doing it better, okay? And you keep thinking at accumulation for a given technology, then this view that you stimulate, how often do they talk about stimulus? This continuous sexual innuendo, right? In economic policy, stimulus, what you have to stimulate, right? And then you get into this idea that the way to stimulate growth is to increase demand somewhat exogenous. Well, it's kind of logical if you think that innovation really doesn't play a major role, and then the key thing is to accumulate a bit more, to work harder, to have more people employed instead of having people doing things better, then it kind of makes sense to think about demand. But that's the mistake, okay? And then from a historical, intellectual point of view, I am a big admirer of this giant that is often misunderstood, Joseph Schumpeter. I don't know if you ever heard of this character. He was kind of Austrian, and he ended up in the United States as usual. He tried to break away from this paradigm more than 100 years ago. His best book is still the one he published in 1911, Theory of Economic Development. And of that, you should read only the first half, because the second half is all concerned with internal Austrian controversies about interest rate and time, and it's, forget it, don't do it. But frankly, and I will mention it a bit more later, another guy that did see the problem, the first, the only one among the classical, is Marx. But basically, he screwed up on technological progress. We'll see in a moment why Marx was really a giant, if you consider when he saw the process and what was his background, and what was were the circumstances in which he elaborated his theory, but he screwed up on a particular important detail. And then the current day, I will be a bit negative. I do believe the new growth theory has been a fairly wasteful detour from the main problem, so a waste of time, and hasn't helped us a lot. And we'll say a few things about what I believe would be useful to do, but obviously it's just my personal opinion. So the idea of growth recurring, why don't you move forward? No. Hello? Swear there is another slide after that, huh? I promise. Oh, you see your... Let me tell you my way, my little model that I never managed to put into mathematical formulation because it's a bit too difficult for me. But maybe some of you are better than me at doing combinatorial mathematics. Imagine the world is a gigantic room in which in the middle of the room, there is a pile of pieces of a puzzle. The biggest puzzle you've ever seen. Millions of pieces. They're all piled up. Total disorder. And then there are, on the side, in the rest of the room, there is some land you can cultivate. And you are one of the old humans. I don't know, you don't need to go back, but let's go back to the first agricultural societies. And when you enter the room, you have two options for your time. You're told that if you manage to figure out a piece of the puzzle will show you how to build a fantastic machine that will improve your productivity a lot. Or otherwise, you can do a very menial thing, which is to scrub the earth and pull up some potatoes that grow spontaneously, eat those. At the beginning, you know very little. Your knowledge of the world is extremely small. You have no idea of how to compose the puzzle. Nobody put even a single piece of the puzzle in its proper place, and you have to survive. And then, you have studied Latin, so you know the primum vivere, the inde philosophare, in which in this case it's innovare. I checked yesterday, apparently that's also Latin, not only Italian, but I'm not sure. Maybe some expert Latinists will tell me that's not true, but that's what I found briefly yesterday night. I want to make sure. And so what is it you do? Well, you realize that the opportunity cost of trying to innovate, trying to work on the puzzle and look at the pieces and say, this goes here, right? And I have found Archimedes' law, for example, you know. Oh, this goes here. Oh, the Pythagoras theorem, damn it. That's pretty good, you know. It takes a long time. Most of the pieces at the beginning, they're just wrong. Even the damn wheel doesn't come out. It's squared sometimes, it's triangle sometimes. You try to make it of stone, like in the comics, and then you go hungry. It's called opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost of spending time to innovate and do science when they're very poor and unproductive is very high. So what do? Well, you go and scrub the earth and get the potatoes, which explains why for thousands of years, probably there's nothing strange from the search theoretical point of view, or even from the mathematical point of view, that innovation came very slowly. There was a lot of stuff that was very difficult to guess. And in fact, when you think of it, one is amazed at thinking, wow, these guys figured out the numbers. I mean, they had no numbers, okay? For the Romans, the way to count was the funny way we use here in monument. It took the Indians to say, well, no, you're 0, 1, 2, that's a lot better. That's a more practical way of doing things. And think about, we got to that only very late. And out of that, we got partita doppia and capitalismo, or a double entry bookkeeping and capitalism. But it took a long time. It was only 1200 after Christ that we got there. So the point there is what? Is to understand that there is nothing so surprising about the long history of innovation. I've seen your hand. The long delay in innovation, and the fact that it took. Oh, because you can't hear me. Yeah. All right. Let me pull the microphone in. There is nothing really puzzling about the fact that for a long time they just thought about cultivating, basically accumulating, getting more horses, more cows. The opportunity cost was too high. And in fact, very few people spent time doing philosophy. And most of them were concerned with strange problems, right? The essence of this, the essence of that, the proof of the existence of God, which was not very useful to improve agricultural productivity. It was maybe useful for something else, but proving or not proving the existence of God, I'm sorry to inform, doesn't increase your productivity of your land. So growth nevertheless occurred. That's why I invite you to read this book by this economic historian whose name now I managed to forget, but it will come out, don't worry, before the end of the talk. Jones, thank you. I heard somebody knows Jones. He's written two beautiful books. One is Growth Recurring and the other is European Miracle. And his theme is to say, look, growth happened. It's not true that economic growth is this strange miracle that occurred only in the United Kingdom, only in England, only in the 17th, 18th century, and never before. There is a narrative, an Anglo-Saxon narrative, of which some of my dear friends have contributed, including one that just died, Ed Prescott, that there was a bit of a miracle in the United Kingdom when the Industrial Revolution came around. There is even a paper, various paper about making a miracle, right? I think they're wrong. It was nothing miraculous. It was not the first time that humanity tried. It was just that building up technology and scientific knowledge takes a long time. And before, as John showed, the episode of growth were fragile. They were fragile technology, very fragile, and they could easily be destroyed by bad weather, or that you had accumulated, or by an invasion, or by any kind of lack of some resource. When you depend only on one resource and you have not diversified, then if you run short of that resource, then growth is over, and so on. Okay. It's only much later that once the puzzle starts to get into place and you can see that now the opportunity cost of contributing to it has gone down because you're much more productive at finding the pieces. You all have played with a puzzle. There is, after a certain stage, it's fun, no? Yeah. Oh, that goes there. Oh, yeah, that's easy, At the beginning, you swear, you hate the idea. You tell your friends, let's change game. This is a waste of time. Let's not do it. Okay. But once it starts to go into places, and that's probably the period of history we're living in. Okay. No, no way. At certain point. So the classics were totally into that. The classics were completely to this point of view. And so if you read the classics, that's their concern. Their concern is how do you distribute wealth and income? The theory of distribution, right? Are wages determined this and this way? What is the source of value, the labor theory? How much do we give to land? How much do we give to capital? But whenever they describe you some story of how England grows, they go to the Malthusian conclusion. Yes, we can grow if there is a period in which land is abundant and there is not enough capital because we don't have enough cows and enough sheep and there are not enough humans. Then with all the open land, we can accumulate more cows and accumulate more humans and we're all happy. But then eventually the ratio between cows, which is capital, land, which is land, and humans becomes right. And there is no reason to grow it. We are at the steady state. You can tell it in very different stories, but you always end up with that conclusion. And it's true of all of them, all of them. You know the model, right? It's the model I had written, and then I took it away yesterday night because I said, no, not the case of using formula. The F of K, L, N, right? Oh, good. And you see, I write capital with K. It's a bit of a, due to the past, I like to write capital with K, the same way, it's from America, we wrote America with a K. It's a reference to the past. Okay. So that was the view, and there was no sustained technological progress. They look for the steady state. Can somebody figure out what the trick is with this? Oh, there is a formula. Oh, this is for those of you that like formulas. That's your standard model. You see, the so-called neoclassical model is in fact, the neoclassical model of growth is in fact the classical model. There's no difference. The only difference is that maybe in the classical story, obviously, they don't have in mind a planner or somebody that maximizes utility. So take away the very first expression that for people that are not used to mathematics may seem funny. There is even the symbol infinity, and there is something very funny there that is supposed to represent a summation. So ignore that. But the rest is fine. It says, look, you have a production function, the national aggregate. You produce output with capital, with labor, and with land. And the output YT, you split it in two parts. In part, you consume it today, and in part, you accumulate and carry over to tomorrow. It's the cows and the grain and the pigs you have tomorrow, okay? And city instead is what you consume today of that stuff. And there are some upper bounds. The land is what it is, so it's a number L, that's the total territory maximum available. So the amount of land you use is bounded above by capital L. And the humans know, you see, I brought NT depends because, you know, you can attach to it your theory, your preferred theory of demographics, but it doesn't really change. It doesn't really change. And in fact, the best theory of demographics economists at that time were capable of coming up with was very stupid. Population just grows exogenous. That's a fantastic theory of demographic growth, right? That's population just grow. Why? Well, because they grow. What the hell? You know? This was the model. And so in that model, you go to a stationary state because there is no way of doing things better. And because one crucial factor called land is what it is, and you can't increase it, then eventually, because it's a crucial, essential factor, and it is what it is, then once you have accumulated enough K and enough N are the people, okay, then you stop, okay? And income per capita reaches its maximum sustainable level, okay? The funny thing is that I'm sure that today, when somebody teaches you macroeconomic policy or macro, they use a simplified version of this. They don't even use this. There's for sure no land. Nobody talks about land anymore, unless they do real estate economics, then they talk about land. And probably there is other simplification. But then we talk about doing macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy in economies like ours, or even United States, by using this. And this is pretty much David Ricardo. 200 plus years and we haven't learned anything. Amazing, huh? See why I said the message is not going to be particularly optimistic. But that's the way it is, I think. Let's see if now we cambi la pesante. Bravo, so you see, that's a non-theory growth. There is no growth. How can you have growth in a world like that? And that's the old 19th century. Here there's a lot of words, but these are in case there are questions. The key point is that there is no technological progress in the long run. There's no technological progress. Economists don't think about technological progress until the end of the 19th century. There is one exception, and it's Karl Marx. I knew, I was asking myself, did I put the slide on Marx or not, or do I leave it to the situation? I think there is, I went on for about half hour, so there is a bit of time to talk about Karl. You see, why is Marx different? I know you all think Baudrillard hates Marx. I actually admire Karl Marx. I think he's one of the greatest of them all. Smart like hell, sarcastic, so much smarter than everybody else, impatient, can't put up with idiots, a real exceptional guy. I like the guy. And he fought hard. He fought hard about the stuff. He had a problem. He believed in the labor theory of value. Why did he believe in the labor theory of value? Because he wanted to prove that there was exploitation, and he wanted exploitation not to be, as correctly Marco Lippi puts, a matter of opinions, which is a fine thing, all right, because it's a conflict between opposite interests. But Marx wanted to be scientific. He had this obsession. I don't know if you ever read it, but the guy was obsessed with being scientific. He had to discover the truth. That was his philosophical background. So he wanted his theory of exploitation not to be Carlito Marx from Treviri opinion. You pay me too little, therefore you're exploiting me, which is a very reasonable statement if you think of it. What's wrong with it? I believe you're exploiting me. You pay me too little. And the answer is, really? Well, find somebody that pays you more. And there you go. You guys can go check the pudding. Okay, that's the way it works. There's nothing wrong about saying you're being exploited. No, he wanted it to be scientific. He wanted it to be an absolute truth. Okay, and he realized, smartly enough, that the way to make it an absolute truth is to say all value comes from labor. Because if all value comes from labor, then there is the value put by what he called alive labor, which is the worker, and the dead labor, which is in capital. But capital can only transfer depreciation into the goods. It's the part of capital that is being used. That's the dead part that gets transferred. So whatever new value there is, because depreciation just recovered, so whatever is true value added, no gross national product, net national product. You remember the difference? They teach you the difference in contabilità nazionale? Gross, net. The difference being depreciation. The depreciation is not value added, is value transferred and recovered, but not added. Then you see, if all the value comes from labor, all the new value, then we're done. Every other payment to factors is exploitation. Perfect. He loved it. You have to read his long notes when he studied very carefully all the classical before him. It's 3 huge gray volumes, Teoria del plus valore, I think they're called in Italian, published by Einaudi, what Einaudi called the scientific series. At least when I bought them back in the 70s, I don't know if they're still published now, but you can find them probably in PDF for free. And he goes very carefully, note by note, to study all those characters, and he says, haha, I like this. With the labor theory value, I go to exploitation. So he gets stuck to that. And that's a bit of a problem. Why? Because then he has the great intuition. He says, capitalism is fantastic. It's a lot better than what was before because it's freeing human creativity. He talks repeatedly of development of the productive forces. Translated into current jargon, it's technological change and capital accumulation. Okay, he talks about development of the productive forces. I actually do not know, or at least I don't remember the proper German word because I don't speak German. In Italian, it's crescita delle forze produttive. Okay, and in English, it's development of the productive forces. So he sees that there is technological change and he goes deeply into it. In his view, technological change is in fact capital augmenting and is labor saving. And it makes sense. the capitalist has to exploit you. What's the way to exploit you? The way to exploit you is to extract more gross value, surplus value, right, from less labor, because then I pay you less, right? And therefore, the law of the increasing organic composition of capital. Ever heard that? They don't teach that anymore. Giorgio, please, in course, Marxist economics has to be taught. Somebody, I volunteer. I had the pleasure of introducing a course in Marxist economic theory at the University of Peking back in 2017, and since then it's being taught properly by one of my students. So I think University of Bologna should also teach Marxian economics properly with formulas and so on. Marco Lippi will be happy, and you can get Marco as a first for the inaugural course. No, it's interesting. The guy thinks seriously about that, and he says, so K over L has to go up. And so far, so good. His point is that he's stuck to the labor theory of value. And you see, that's where you get screwed. Think about it. So he understands that there is technological change. He understands that the game is, I want to make profit, so I want to produce stuff with less and less labor, where labor is any resource, right? I want to be factor saving, as David and I like to say. David here is David Levine. So far, so good. It makes sense. Historically, it's actually what eventually happened and was happening during his time. So he sees that right. That implies that the capital over labor ratio goes up. That's also true. Check the data. K over Y goes up, K over L goes up. No matter how you measure them, it's going up. Okay? And it keeps going up for 2 centuries. He misses the key thing. If all the value and all net national product has to come from labor, from raw labor, and there is no, how can I say, increase in the productivity of labor. It's not that an hour of labor suddenly become tens and 100 and 1,000 because there is more knowledge capital. Then eventually, because you squeeze in the amount of labor you use, output cannot grow anymore. And so the stuff available to pay profit does not increase as fast as the stuff that requires profit, capital. Capital has increased a lot. There's a lot of capital, but there is little stuff that goes around because it comes from labor. And the labor theory of value says it has to correspond to the value of labor. Then you can no longer pay profits. And there comes the other law. Lotta comunista, anybody? Jesus, kids. The law of the tendenza, la caduta tendenziale del saggio di profitto. I know it only in Italian, I'm sorry, because I learned it when I was younger than you are, okay? But it's a key law in the view of Marx, where he gets it wrong. And why does he get it wrong? He gets it wrong at the last step, because he wants to stick to the labor theory of value. He cannot see the technological progress to the extent that increases productivity of labor allows the output to grow a lot more than the quantity of labor. And so there is plenty of output to pay for the increasing capital, to pay profits on capital, to pay even increasing wages. That's where he misses the thing. And because in his view, correctly, you don't invest, you don't accumulate unless you earn a profit, he gets to his scientific conclusion, which notice, that's the part that everybody thinks, Marx didn't want the technological progress, Marx was green, Marx was an Anguria. No, Marx was not an Anguria. Marx was technological progress all the way. That's why we need socialism. Socialism in Marx becomes necessary because of this. At a certain point, the growth of the productive forces that requires accumulation of capital cannot be sustained, cannot continue in a market economy. For the reason I said, because the capitalist, in order to invest, wants profit. And there's not enough stuff to pay profit. So he doesn't have the motivation. And so with private property, he will not invest anymore. And you get a steady state. He hates a steady state. He doesn't want the steady state. From that point of view, he's totally non-classical. And he says, therefore, that's why we have to socialize the means of production. If capital becomes public, in the sense that its own, he has this mythological view. It doesn't mean it has to be owned by Giorgia Meloni or Giuseppe Conte or Matteo Salvini or even Matteo Renzi or whatever you choose, Enrico Lego. No. He has this view that we all go to a town meeting and decide what to do with Silicon Valley. All right, but he's a philosopher. Come on, he's writing in the 19th century. Don't get carried. Don't pretend too much from the poor guy. The guy is really smart. You see, he makes it scientific. That's what part people don't understand about Marx. Marx wants socialism, not just because he's so furious. No. He wants socialism because he thinks it's unavoidable scientifically to keep growing. Only if you socialize the means of production, you can tell people, okay, let's keep accumulating even if there is no profit. There's no profit to give, that's okay. We don't need the motivation of profit. This is state ownership. We just keep accumulating without profit. Obviously, at that point, everything unravels. We understand why the calculation is incorrect. It doesn't understand about incentive. Lots of stuff we have learned. But I wanted to stress that he is the absolute first economist before Schumpeter, which is why, if you read Schumpeter, History of Economic Analysis, you understand that Schumpeter was known as a liberal free marketer, blah, 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 right? But he has a huge admiration of Marx. In fact, there is a sense in which you can read the History of Economic Analysis as a dialogue between him and Marx that says, it's just you and me. The only two guys that understood anything, but I understood better than you, and so I'm fixing whatever mistakes you made. And it's a long reading, but it's a fascinating reading. You should do it. Okay, so that's economic growth for the classical. Now, I forget the barrier didn't solve the problem. The neoclassical. Okay. So Marx had this intuition, but strange enough, Marxism became a bit of a different beast from what the guy had in mind. The only one that I know that thought seriously about that and said there is something wrong with what we're doing was Antonio Gramsci when he was in jail. And a little bit before when he wrote, a revolution against capital. He didn't mean capital in the sense of the capitalist. He meant a revolution against Das Kapital, the book by Karl Marx. And he was talking about the Russian Revolution, the Leninist Revolution, 1917. He had, he took Marx seriously. He said, well, if socialism has to come for the reason he said, it's a bit too early. Okay, the time are not right. We're doing something the wrong way. Better try to figure out what's going on. He was in jail, couldn't do it. Instead, what happened was that the whole debate after Marx with the Marxists concentrate in the political side. And it becomes a bit of a silly debate, and still is, and I frankly find it somewhat boring, the ideological debate between free marketer and Marxist, right? Because it became a debate between the theorists of Leninism at the end, of realized socialism or planned economies in the various versions. Great contribution came from a neoclassical Italian economist. I don't know if they teach this now, but in case they don't, go read Antonio Barone, Il Ministro della Produzione nell'Economia Collettivista. It's a genius piece. The guy is a neoclassic, he has Barra in mind, and he says, but assume there is socialism. How do we plan the system? It's Marx. See, that's the point. Marx says we need socialism, not just because we want to wave red flags and stop technological progress because we are angry. No, we need socialism to keep accumulating more. So the Ministro della Produzione in an economia collettivista has to keep accumulating more. And he has to plan how to invest and accumulate. Now, it's a paper, I don't remember, very early, before World War I. I forgot the exact year, but you should read. But the problem is that there's no debate about growth, basically. They keep fighting over, if free market are better than Ministro della Produzione and so on, and the issue of what the term is growth disappear. The only one that thinks about it is Schumpeter. I'll come to Schumpeter in a moment, but he's really alone in this debate. None of the so-called neoclassical economists at that part of the century are thinking about the issue of development of productive force. No, you cannot find it in Edgeworth, you cannot find it in Pigot, you cannot find it in any of the Marshall, and so on. You find a lot of other interesting microeconomic theory, the tools that are useful, right? From the Edgeworth box to Marshall theory of cost and so on. It's useful stuff, but it's not about growth and innovation. And then, you know, the Great Depression come, and then there is the World War II, and we're talking about Keynes and aggregate demand. So when we get out of the war and we start growing again, what becomes the focus of the debate? Interesting enough, the focus of the debate among economic theorists is capitalism doesn't work. That was the opinion. Even Schumpeter, it's very funny. You have to read the last book of Schumpeter, the one that is popular, everybody read, called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, because the guy, the whole first part is again about Marx, he's again debating with Marx, obsessed by Marx, but it's a different type of obsession. He has the feeling that he's losing the battle. Because in those years, the book is written in 1943, if I am correct, so in the middle of the war. And Schumpeter is in the United States, he's at Harvard. Probably Harvard, Cambridge must have the wrong kind of water. If you drink too much water in Cambridge, Massachusetts, your brain starts thinking strange things. Because he gets absolutely convinced that capitalism, the market system cannot work. And there's only one way of making it work, which is to create a lot of monopolies. And the argument is very interesting. The argument is, look, central planning works. He's convinced. Everybody at that time are convinced that in Russia, in the Soviet Union, central planning is doing wonders. That they're becoming rich like more than us, that it's working perfectly. For somehow they don't understand that the airplanes, the tanks, the whatever is being used on the Eastern Front is actually produced in the Midwest and shipped over to the Russian. That unfortunately the Russians are putting bodies and millions of bodies, but not much actual metallurgical stuff. And so the conviction is that these socialist planned economies are working a lot better than the market economies. And therefore you need to replicate that. And Schumpeter, being a true ideologue of private property, goes through a very convoluted argument. He says, you know, I want to keep private property. But on the other hand, I want planning. How do I get the two? Well, what about monopolies? If I have a monopolistic company, they have time. They're not afraid about competition. Nobody's competing with them. They're monopolists, right? They can plan for the long run. They're not in troubles of going broke. There is no shakeout. There is none of that. They can just go control, extract surplus quietly, and that will be the solution. So the guy that in 1911, I will mention in a moment, had written a revolutionary book saying it's all into innovation and competition. In 1943, is theorizing that we should create an economy made of oligopolies and so on. So that's the dominant point of view. And it becomes very famous, this view that is exemplified by the Harrod-Domar model. Do they teach the Harrod-Domar model? No? Okay. The Harrod-Domar model should be taught because it's a beautiful example of how, you know, by simplifying too much, you end up producing nonsense. The Harrod-Domar model, Harrod is Mr. Harrod, and Domar is a famous economist that studied the Soviet economic development for a while, have this very simple model in which the economy is a fixed coefficient production function. So it's that production function I had before, but even more extreme. Capital and labor produce aggregate output in a fixed ratio. 2 machines, 7 workers. That's it. No matter what. No technological change whatsoever. No way of substituting machines with workers, workers with machines. Okay? In an economy like this, you have to essentially keep accumulating and keep employing people at a ratio 2 to 7. Right? What happens if by any chance you have more capital than available workers? Companies go broke. There's too much capital. There are not enough workers. The wages take everything. And the capitalists got nothing. So you have Great Depression all over, you know, for the market failure in the sense of companies failing. Okay. What in the opposite case? What if you have way more workers and little capital? Then in that case, you have mass unemployment. riots and poverty, and wages are very low. Well, if to that story you add the hypothesis which they made, which is very funny, the demographic hypothesis I said before, labor just grows exogenously. The workers just keep going up at 1.2% a year. Why? Because I said so. That's a very scientific approach, right? Why? I said so. About where my cugino told me. He read it on the internet. Okay. Well, you understand that you have a perfect model in which everything that can go wrong will actually go wrong. Nothing can go right in an economy like that. There is either too much capital and then all the companies shut down, or there is too much labor and everybody is unemployed and starving and rioting. Okay. You will not believe me, but trust me, the dominant view in the late 40s and early 50s among the very top economic departments in the world was this, the one I just described. And they thought that this was a good justification for Keynesian policies. So you see, we have improved a lot, at least since that. I mean, we have a less ridiculous justification for Keynesian policies, but that was the view. And here comes this famous paper, I'm sure you all heard about it, by Bob Solow. Actually, Bob Solow at the time wrote a bunch of papers. He published all of them in 1956, so one has to be careful which one this is, but this is the one called A Contribution to the Theory of Growth, which everybody quotes, and everybody pretends to read, and everybody pretends to know, but it's not true. Nobody reads it, and nobody knows what's in it, including some of the top economists in the world. Why? Because Solow writes that paper to point out that Harrod and Domar are being a bit too exaggerated. He says, listen, true, in your world, it's a disaster, no matter where you turn. But please, just consider the following. Assume, please, that if there is a lot of workers that want to work and wages go down, then companies will have an incentive to change the ratio, no longer 2 to 7, 2 machine to 7, maybe 2 machine to 8, 9 workers, okay? And vice versa, if there are very few workers and wages are very high and it costs a lot to hire new employees and capital instead is cheap, maybe firms will try to use machines a little bit. Maybe they use 3 machines every 7 workers, maybe 4. Because if you allow me that very simple hypothesis, then this disaster you're talking about that is supposed to happen every 2 seconds and we're all dead is no longer happening. Okay? That's the message of the paper. That's the message. So it's a very simple message. And if you think it's political message, the debate is all political. One of the things I'm trying to suggest to you is that all economic theory of growth, in fact, most of the macroeconomic theory is political, in the sense that it's motivated by ongoing political debates, by concerns that come from outside the profession. It's not like the quantum physicists that don't care what they're debating in parliament or if the unions are striking or not. No, no. Macroeconomists in particular are very much influenced in the long run by the political debate. In fact, the political debate in those years affect this a lot. What's funny, though, is that because he's concerned with that problem, Solow at a certain point describes the production function. Check. Somebody, can you download the from JSTOR, the paper? Check. Go. And he draws the graph and he says, look, to study the problem, we can have actually 3 cases. One case, the production function is so unproductive that this economy dies no matter what. So that's not what Harrod and Neumann have in mind. I will not discuss that. In the second case, the economy is reasonably productive, but not too much. So there is a steady state. And Harrod and Domar want to have a steady state. They're talking about the instability of the steady state. So I will study this case. And he says, by the way, there is a third case, and it's the case in which there is persistent growth forever, no steady state. And he makes a note, he puts that in a footnote, which I always mention, footnote number 6 that nobody has read. What is that he does in footnote number 6? He points out briefly that obviously in an economy with that kind of production function, concavity, the stuff they teach you at school, there could be unbounded growth even without technological change. All that is needed is that capital is a very good substitute for labor, that it's possible to reduce the number of workers per unit of output by just increasing the number of machines per unit of output. very Marxist, okay? And that's very well known in 1956. It's so well known that Bob Solow puts in a footnote, and he writes a simple formula, square root of R plus BR. He says, if you need an example, here is an example, okay? I'm sure you're wondering why Baudrillard stresses this thing. Well, Baudrillard stresses this thing because it's very relevant, that footnote, and it's very relevant, this whole thing. And it's very relevant that it was completely missed for 40 years, completely missed. So why didn't Solow knew that? Why did he know? Didn't know that? He knew that because about 20 years before, some guy again from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, John von Neumann, had been asked by his friend in Vienna if he could solve. His friends were economists. If he could solve a mathematical problem that they were hitting their head against and couldn't solve, that had to do with describing an economy with many sectors, many commodities that was growing over time. And von Neumann was objectively a true genius. Said, yeah, sure, you know, right now I'm actually smoking and having sex, but maybe I can do that with my left hand. And he wrote this paper. He gave it to the economists, and they said, wow, what a genius. But nobody understood the damn paper. The paper, you should study it, and I advocate it should be the first paper of the modern theory of economic growth, because it shows very simply that if you have a very simple linear economy without technological progress, no technological progress at all, okay? Everybody keeps doing exactly the same thing every day, every second, like yesterday. But nevertheless, in an economy like that, because you can use activities that are linear, there is no limit to growth. The only limit to growth is the fact that at some point you hit a fixed resource. And he does it in a very generous setting with millions of commodities, millions of firms, nothing aggregate. Why is that important? Because it makes you understand that for a given technology, the rate of growth in an economy without technological progress, the rate of growth is determined by the speed at which the slowest growing essential input grows. Are you following me? Okay. Imagine. There is a beautiful example by Koopmans that has to do with humans and rabbits, but it has a bit of sexual innuendos. And even if it was offered to the Accademia Scientifica, the Pontificia Accademia Scientifica Scripta Varia, I don't think I should follow Koopmans in his innuendos, but you can find it. It's about humans and rabbits. So let's do it in a more abstract setting. You know, if you have a bunch of inputs and they're all entering and producing output, and also then there are other functions in which you produce those inputs. So the economy grows more or less smoothly because the inputs grow, they produce themselves and they produce output and then produce themselves and produce output. Okay, and then you ask yourself, what in the long run, an economy like this, how fast could it grow? The answer is, well, if it has to grow with all the inputs that are necessary, they all have to grow at the same rate, right? There is the so-called balanced growth idea. They teach you balanced growth, right? No? Yes? I see somebody say yes. Well, it's John von Neumann. He was the first that had it. Okay? He computed the balanced growth rate that is maximum for a given technology. It's a Perron-Frobenius application. It's an application of the Perron-Frobenius theorem about eigenvalues. And then he says, okay, but if this is so, and every input has to grow at the same rate, if some of them tend to grow faster than others, like the rabbits, okay, and some of them grows more slowly than the other, like the doctor in philosophy, what will be the growth rate of the overall economy? Well, not that of the rabbits, the one of the doctors in philosophy, because they have the slowest growing input. Now, you may think that this is a triviality, maybe it is, but it is not. And I will try to show you toward the end. I still have about 15 minutes to go, 20 minutes to go, then I leave you insulting me. that this is actually very essential, and it helps a lot to understand both Italy and China today, which is toward the end of the talk. But that was something that the growth theorists had understood. So some rare character had read for Neumann. Solow was one of them. Lionel Mackenzie, who had been his student and had translated the paper in English, was another. And so the growth theorists knew this, that the issue in growth theory was not if there could be growth. Obviously, there could be growth. In the way I just described, there could be growth forever. But they also had read Schumpeter. Which Schumpeter? The one of 1911. And what is that Schumpeter in 1911 had said? Schumpeter in 1911 had said something very practical. He said, ladies and gentlemen, we economists keep talking about accumulation, investment accumulation, more pigs, more cows, more land, more grain, and so on. And we think that we're all becoming wealthy because of that. Well, you're all wrong. He says, think seriously. Think of an economy in which the only thing you do is to accumulate. You keep making bread like the day before. You keep milking the cows in the same way. You keep growing whatever product you grow in the field with the same technology, okay? You just accumulate. Look at historical experience of this. We had periods of technological stagnation, the old Middle Age, in the countryside, 1300, 1400. What was the growth rate? At best, 0.01% a year. Economies where the only source of growth is accumulation, like we write in the model, more capital, more workers, more land, grow very slowly. He says, ladies and gentlemen, look around. When the Industrial Revolution started, GNP started suddenly to grow at 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% a year. I know that this may sound strange. Everybody has this miraculous view that the Industrial Revolution was very fast growth. No, 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 no. The initial growth was high for historical standards, but low compared to what we're used now. Now we're used to, China grows 12%. That's enormously more than what United Kingdom was growing in 1780 or 1810. Then it accelerated a bit, 0.5. At the end of the 19th century, it had reached 1.2, and Schumpeter was careful observer. He reports a number of things. He was writing more bigger books full of data about business cycle, in which he had all the data about chemicals and steel and this and that. He said, well, now we're growing much faster. But we're growing much faster because of technological innovation. So stop thinking about growth in the static economy where technology does not change, and think about what the true source of growth is, which is the development of the productive forces, is technological change. And the old book, I call it TED, but it stands for Theory of Economic Development. It's not the TED you have in mind. You must read the book. Read the first 3 chapters. They're beautiful. It's all words. There are no equation, not even a graph. But the guy is really extremely lucid. He can see it, and he describes the way it works, and he says, look, and the thing that matters is not the invention. It's truly the economic innovation. Economic innovation. Then he gets into classification. I'm sure they taught you that he has 5. No? You didn't know? No? Well, he decides there are 5 types of innovation. That's obviously confusion. There is innovation is innovation. It comes in millions of ways, and there's only one. You just do things differently. Period. That's innovation. Every time you do things different, every time you open a restaurant in a different location in town, or you go, even if you go to work at a different time and start doing your day differently, that could be an innovation. If it works, it makes you more productive. I'm sure you're going to use it again. If not, you don't. Okay. And he has this very clear view. He says innovation comes in all sizes and shapes. And in an open society, he doesn't use this terminology, but that's what he describes. They keep coming. And so he has this beautiful intuition that he says in words, here is the way in which, he says, open societies, market economies work. He's very optimistic at the time. He becomes pessimistic 30 years later. He says, at every point in time, there is a technology. And that technology has a tendency, if it is not changed at all, to bring to an equilibrium in the sense of a constancy. He calls it equilibrium, means steady state, which is kind of rash. Imagine really living in a world where nothing ever changes. Same number of people, same age distribution, same commodities, same goods, same production techniques, same factories, same consumption pattern. Short of external disaster, tsunamis and things like that, that economy is going to be very stable, right? Sure, if a plague arrives, then that economy collapses because people die. If it gets invaded by an army, then the economy collapses. But the economic factor per se, if you keep repeating, will lead to a huge stability. Very boring stability, but stability. He says, okay, that's the way the system tends to grow, and that's the sense in which we tend to go to equilibrium. But he says there is the entrepreneurs. There are these characters that want to make money. They want to make profits. So he sees the other aspect from Marx. They want to make profits, and they understand that the only way to make profits is to do things differently. He gets a bit lyrical about that. I don't tend to get lyrical. That's, okay. But it's a good insight. It's a very good insight because it puts that it points to the key thing. The key thing is that a bunch of people have an incentive to try to do things differently. And they do it because they want to compete and make some extra money. They're not doing it because they love you. That's all crap. That's nothing to do with effective altruism. They do it for their own interest. But the point is that if it works and they make money, it's because their different ways of doing things has made a product that you like cheaper. There's no other way out. You can try to make all the things different that you want, but if your customer don't like it, they don't buy it. And typically, they like it if it is something, it has some characteristic that they appreciate, and you're able to give it to them at a price lower than the other people. You can turn it around as many times you want. You can call it marketing. You can put a lot of bells and whistles around, but that's what it is. That's what it is. Okay, and that's the great intuition that Schumpeter has. That's the great intuition because he says, you see, this makes the instability of the system. Because the system per se would go to this very boring equilibrium without technological change. But then there are all these damn innovators, and they imitate each other. They see that one guy is doing better, says, I'll do that too. Actually, I'll try to outdo him. And then she says, and I say, no, me too. And everybody wants to do it, and it's a mess. And that changes prices, continues, changes prices, changes basket of commodity, changes way of doing things, moves worker from a way or another. There's a beautiful discussion, all verbal. You probably heard about something called rational expectations, right? It's kind of fashionable, right? Well, he has rational expectation way before Moore, because he has a beautiful discussion in which he says the innovator that knows that he's a big guy has to think not if his new product or his new way of doing things is profitable today at given prices. No. He has to make a much more complicated calculation. He has to say, if tomorrow I show up in the market with my new product, they use these new factors for production and gets a worker that currently is producing bread and take him to produce grissini, okay, breadsticks, then I have to be profitable then at the new prices. To the extent that due to the innovation, prices will change and factor allocation will change. I have to be profitable then, not now. It's too easy to figure out if you're profitable now, but you have to be able to do rational expectation and compute the new equilibrium and take a bet. Obviously, it's very practical. It says people take a bet. They're not gods. They just say, more or less, I should make it, boom, and they go. Often they break their nose, but that's the beauty of the thing. Well, but that's a big contribution, the guy. And the guy is very explicit. He says, and this process may bring about further innovation, hence the instability of the market mechanism, or can bring about stagnation if eventually we create monopolies or we create circumstances in which the incentive to innovate disappear, which are the most variable. That's why it's a giant, you see, because it was writing all this in 1911. Nobody paid attention. Then the Depression came, and they all started talking about effective demand. Von Neumann wrote the mathematics. They ignored it. Solow put it in a footnote in 56. Half a century had passed and nobody was noticing. The funny thing was people were noticing, but this will take a different lecture, much more technical that nobody studies. There was a tradition of people that did what was called turnpike theory, growth theory, but it was very mathematical, very abstract, a bit too much. I grew up in that tradition, but I have to admit it was way out there in the somewhat metaphysical space of mathematics, and most macroeconomists didn't even know about it. Literally, they did not know. And it's in fact why eventually the so-called new growth theory came up. But before going to new growth theory, let me go back to for Neumann what I promised you, why it's relevant for China and Italy. Forget that. Forget, I put a bit of mathematics, but now I don't have time. Otherwise, it's too late. We'll do it with words and intuition. You're all very smart. Okay? Just start from the line before the last, the thing I said before, right? If the technology is constant, there is possibility of growth. It's balanced growth, okay? And you have to keep accumulating all the inputs at a certain speed, okay? So if you create a situation in which innovation is no longer in the game, doesn't matter why, political, taxes, whatever, you know, think about it. But let's assume, you know, Italians have become enamored with tradition. They want to go back to the 1960s. They want the Vespa, mandolin, whatever. But de gustibus non disputandum est. I don't live here and it's not by chance. But assume you're right. The pizza, whatever, you know, kilometro zero, let's all grow our cow in the, on the terrace. I put the pig in the bathroom, and so the salami is fresher, stuff like that. That's good. De gustibus, non disputandum est. Good. But then you need all the inputs to grow. You got to at least do that, right? See, among the inputs, there is what they call, well, my friend Aldo Rustichini calls it the smart fraction. Smart fraction is the fact that we're not all identical. Some people are, how can I say, quicker than others, you know? They just do it faster. Not the thing you're thinking about. No, they do faster something else. All right? So those are inputs of production too. You see, inputs of production are very varied. They're not just aggregate capital, aggregate labor. That's silly. Inputs of production are millions of different people with different capabilities. If you start choosing that you don't want to change technology because you want the fresh salami, fine. But you got to keep in town the guys that invented the Lambretta. You got to keep in town the guys that invented the Olivetti typing. You got to keep in town the Armani guy. You got to keep in town the Renzo Piano or whatever, you know, I'm just throwing up big names. You have to keep in town the smart fraction. If you create a situation for which the smart fraction kisses you goodbye and goes to London, when it goes to London, or it goes to San Francisco, or even it goes to Barcelona, for that matter, then you got a problem, even if you don't want to innovate, because some crucial inputs are not growing anymore. You start having an imbalance. You see, you start having a lot of mediocre, not so productive people, and too few of the very productive people. I was saying politically correct words, and you know, in a public university, I don't want to say that, but you start having an imbalance, and it's called balance growth for a good reason. If you really want to grow on that turnpike without technological change, at the minimum, keep all the inputs growing at the same rate, for Christ's sake. If you don't make them all grow at the same rate, then you have an even worse problem. Not only you don't have innovation, you're even missing a piece of the pie, and then no pie, right? If you miss a piece of the pie, you cannot make apple pie without apples. It's no longer apple pie. Well, that's Italy's problem. To me, that's clearly Italy's problem. Problem number one is the country, for whatever reason, has decided that innovation is not what we like. Fine. Let's stick to tradition. We have great tradition. We have notoriously all descending from Cicero and Augustus and Leonardo, and all the best people that worked the peninsula, and Lucrezia Borgia. We're all fantastic people. Fine, so let's stick to the tradition, but at least let's do balanced growth. Let's keep all the inputs. Because if we also unbalance that, and that's, you understand, it's clearly what we're doing, given the current pattern of migration and immigration, then we have a serious problem. And I could go on, because obviously there's not only that, there's also a ratio between the number of people working and the number of people consuming. There is a ratio among people that are in their 30s and people that are in their 60s. There is a ratio between number of people that are in the factory and people that are, I don't know how to call that job. Right. So you got to keep those ratios constant. If you really want to do the 60s, good, do the 60s, but try to have the ratios of the 60s. You can't do the 60s with the ratios of the 2020s because it's completely unbalanced. And I'm serious. If you look at where the problems are, forget about innovation because that's so gigantic. I don't even want to discuss. You understand that that's, you've got ratios that are completely unbalanced. China has a similar problem, but China accepts innovation. What's the problem with China today? It's very simple. In that case, it's a for Neumann. I worked on this, a bunch of us worked on this. You can write the model I discussed before and allow for technological change. It's not so impossible. It's a mathematical bit of a trick, but you can show that you can create activities, combination of inputs that produce new inputs that were never available before. And that allows you endogenous technological change, even in a world a la von Neumann. Okay. But what's the problem in that world? Again, there is a problem with having all the right inputs growing at the same speed. China is now hitting the wall of human capital. So they're hitting a problem similar to Italy, but from a different angle. They're just unable to grow human capital at the appropriate speed. When you're growing at 15% a year, 12% a year, it's easy to grow cement 12% a year. It's easy to grow metallurgical plants at 12% a year. Even airplanes, even high-speed trains, they have a very good high-speed. It's not easy to grow highbrow engineers, chemists, biologists, doctors, mathematicians at 12% a year. Eventually, that core part of knowledge capital starts growing slowly because it grows at the speed at which nature makes it grow. You have to build a generation, they have to turn 18, they have to go to the university, they have to study, there is a selection, not all of them accomplishes what they tried. Eventually they get 23, 24, they learn. At 30, they're ready to roll to be top scientists, but it's taken 30 years, that's the speed. And when you have a demographic collapse on one hand, and you are trying to catch up with the frontier, then your ability to grow human capital. And it's quite visible. Why is that all of a sudden Xi Jinping and company are trying to be nice with the West? Because they understand that they need to keep sending their kids to the universities in the West to grow the human capital. The real stumbling block in the country is this. The knowledge factor is growing much more slowly. I mean, it's growing at what it's reasonable it grows. After the initial phase in which everybody is ignorant and you can just teach millions of people, millions of things that they know nothing. And so boom, 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 it grows very quickly because it's very easy to go from knowing absolutely nothing to being able to calculate the square root of 9. Eventually to make everybody a frontier scientist, that's much, 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 much more complicated. So that's one way of using these models to understand what goes on in both countries. It's a very abstract point of view, but I believe it actually captures the essence. Okay, so that was one application. Another one is to observe these. You see, Solow did that paper I mentioned to you, and people said, oh, what a beautiful model. Let's use it for everything. But there was Schumpeter insisting that growth came from technological progress. So Solow again came to the rescue of himself. He said, you probably heard about TFP, right? Total factor productivity. In Italian, it's called, what's the name? Produttività totale dei fattori. something like that. Yeah. And it's a trick, right? And the poor guy is very honest. If you read his work, he says, look, it's just a trick. I'm just trying to compute a very rough estimate of what is being the total technological change in this economy. But it's not a theory. He insists for years. I don't know why, but we ended up deciding that it was a theory. I think it's because of the demographic. You remember what I said? What's the preferred demographic theory for an economist? People grow. At what? How much? 1.2%. Why? Because my cugino said so. I think that with TFP, we have done the same thing, only it's the cugina, just to make sure that we treat both sexes the same way, right? So demographic is taken care of by the cugino, TFP is taken care of by the cugino. And, you know, it's not a big theory of innovation to say that innovation happened just because they happen. And they always happen at the same rate, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do to change their rate. Unfortunately, that's the way most macro models work. And as you know, there is this debate between fresh water and salt water in the United States, which would have used to be Chicago versus Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's no longer true because they all use the same model. It's that old debate that in Italy people still believe to exist between Keynesian on the salt side of the ocean, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and monetarist on the freshwater side of the Lake Michigan in Chicago, doesn't exist. It's passé. It's irrelevant. Okay, and it's irrelevant because everybody on one side or the other use the same Solow model with a steady state and exogenous technological progress. And there are very small differences in how you model price formation, but it's not a big deal. The limit of that is what? The limit of that is that the growth part, the instability part, the innovation part, the story I told you about Schumpeter, all these guys going around, changing prices, has disappeared. It's never considered. The description of the aggregate economy is very simple. The aggregate economy increases productivity exogenously at a constant rate that comes from the sky, exactly like the demographics. And then it has this aggregate combination of K and L, and that is supposed to go to a steady state value, a stationary value with a certain ratio of K to L. And that's what we are supposed to study. And that's what fiscal policy and monetary policy is about. I know I'm making it a bit brutal, but it's not so brutal. If we had time, I could, you can check the equation that it's exactly what I just described. Why is this the problem? Well, this is the problem because now I'm expressing strictly my view, but I think it's a problem because I think Schumpeter was right. The oscillation, the instability, and the growth are one and the same thing. You can't separate the two. The essence of the dynamics of an economic system, of a market system, has to do with the instability caused by innovation. Sure, there are other sources of instability. There is COVID, for example. There is policy. True. Or there is Russia invading Ukraine. True. But when I really think at the long run and I think at the big cycle and the oscillations and the change in growth, and some country grows and some other countries does not grow, Italy is not that it doesn't grow compared to Spain because of COVID or because of the war, right? It grows because there is more innovation, less innovation, or because the balance of factors is right or is not right. And in order to understand that, I need to use a model, a theory that allows for the creation of productive factor and the creation of technologies to be inside the model, not fixed from outside. Because if it is fixed from outside, the model is useless, right? If it is what my cugina said, why do I have a model? I just ask the cugina, right? And then I say, well, questo lo dice lei, and it's all solved. Why are you spending all this time with statistics and mathematics and formulas if it is already established somewhere else? That's a big problem. I try to make it to make you laugh a bit, because I understand you're tired. I've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes. But it's really a problem. You see, I'm a bit nostalgic. There was a period after the big stagflation, during the big stagflation of the 70s, something that they're cooking for us, but this would be another lecture these days, and they're cooking for us because they didn't listen. Okay. There was a moment in which in the profession, people said, maybe the stuff we're using needs a drastic revision. We don't need to fix just the little details of the model. We need to rethink the micro foundations of our models with which we do economic policy, because it's clearly not works. In the middle 70s, it became quite apparent that the kind of tools that were being used to do fiscal and monetary policy were not working. And the kind of tools that were being used, trust me, they were the same, unfortunately, that we're using now again. Okay, and they had produced stagflation. You know what stagflation is, right? It's a situation in which there is high inflation, even higher than you observe now. It reached even 20% in some countries. And nevertheless, there is very slow growth or no growth at all. And why do I say nevertheless? Because from that funny model I wrote there, people derive this methodology called the Phillips curve, according to which if you make inflation go up, yeah, there is inflation, but growth also goes up. And if instead when inflation goes down, then growth goes down. It's totally false in the data. Have you ever checked, even in Italian data, if it is true or not? Go check. Italy is the best contradiction to that nonsense. The decades of high growth in Italy were decades of very low inflation, extremely low inflation. Okay, and the decades of slow growth were decades of high inflation. And then there are these recent decades, there have been both slow growth and slow inflation, or no growth and no inflation. And now we'll see what this future year will show us. Okay. But anyhow, at that time, people took the failure very seriously. Right now, we're not. Right now, there is no open criticism of what the monetary and fiscal policies have been since 2015, 2016. And there was a period, about 20 years, in which people tried to see if they could come around with models of growth and cycles that were working together, where there was. I would say we failed. I think the basic reason was that the process was very complicated. You had to rediscuss a set of established points of view that had been there in the profession, in the research for a good century, in particular the notion of balanced growth and steady state and so on, the notion of exogenous technological progress. And this required quite a bit of effort, and the policy demand was too strong. There was a, you see, we go back to the theme I was saying, that research in economics about economic growth is always driven by policy demand. It doesn't have a life from inside. It's not like algebraic topology that works from inside, doesn't wait for somebody from outside asking a policy question. In macroeconomics, policy question becomes dominant. It was quite clear that the pressure to provide the politician with an answer to their thing was too strong. And those are the years in which this thing called new growth theory explodes. And what is the new growth theory is? Well, it's a going back to the aggregate model by twisting around the production function and say, well, there are some kind of a crazy return due to externalities, instead of having exogenous technological progress or having the Schumpeterian von Neumann world with many innovators here and there. I don't have time to go through that. My honest view is that it wasn't a great contribution. 40 years later, because it started out in the mid-80s and then it grew in the 90s, and now, what is that we know about growth and its determinants that we did not know back then? I'll leave you to your questions to discuss that, because my answer is nothing. We spent about 40 years debating about externalities, reaching the conclusion that small countries should be very poor because they don't have external effects, and large countries like India should be very rich, just the opposite of what happened. And creating a a view that everything was an external effect, so we had to subsidize all kind of startup enterprises because they have this positive external effect. The result is that the countries that have spent their money subsidizing startups have gone nowhere. The countries that have let their startups do whatever they want, including fail when they don't work, have got Silicon Valley. And so I guess that doesn't really work with these. And in the meanwhile, the world has kept growing its own way with extraordinary things like China and India that haven't done any of the thing that the so-called new growth theory has suggested. If you think of the growth of China is very simple. At certain point, they told people in certain areas, you're free to do whatever you want. Well, not really whatever, actually, very limited. You're free to give it a try. And they gave it a try. And then they extended a bit. They says, you're even freer to give it a try. And they gave it a try. They surely produced a mess. Some people became very rich. Some people didn't. Growth was very unequal, also because they did it by areas. And so it became very local. But the fact that that's what they did was, if you look at the economic history of China in the last 40 years, you see zero subsidies. The subsidies are all for the old enterprises that don't grow. But the new economy or whatever has grown, has all grown without externalities, without the theory of externality behind itself, and without the subsidies that the theory of externalities bring about. So it's perfect negation of what's called the new growth theory. And it is, in fact, also for the reason I said before, I think it's a big confirmation of the fact that the old ideas of looking at technological progress as due to these small thousands, millions of little innovation, and having in mind that all this little innovation keep changing relative prices and therefore produce periods of growth, but also periods of decay because some investment goes wrong, because prices change the wrong way, because their investment doesn't work and produces a failure. That's the way it works. It's not a miracle. Economic growth is not this balanced path where everything grows smoothly and there is never a problem, never a depression. No. Very often, because due to trial and error and changing relative price, it produces failure. And the failure are called recession, or are called disaster sometimes, even if they become big sale failures. But that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. I had underestimated how long I would have talked about Marx and this, and now I think it's time for me to give you the word. So I will leave you the last slides for you to read. I leave them online on looking forward. While I'm looking forward, instead of talking myself, I let you talk if you have questions, and I say thank you for the patience. As they say, question, criticism. Go ahead.
English. Yeah.
Whatever.
My question is about today, because we are used to think about economic growth with a better life. But I imagine what's happening in California with the economic growth and immigration and different level of people with a lot of homeless people. So what's your explanation for what's happening in California?
In California, it's happening everywhere. Why California?
Because there's a book.
Because you read a book. In the Free Republic of Santa Monica, there were more homeless than anywhere in the time I lived there back in 1987. Among other things, because in the Free Republic of Santa Monica, they give you food, the parks are open, people are very nice, they're all rich and generous. So homeless from around the world goes there. Why stay in Chicago freezing? If you can go to Santa Monica, you go to Santa Monica. So that's one. I don't have an answer for that. There have always been homeless people. Homelessness has gone down dramatically. That's the one thing. So if the question is about growth in general, I have to recur to my friend Sally Martin, that has run a million regression. Xavier is quite something. Seriously, homelessness is one of the aspects of being poor. Poor in the sense of having an income below what's needed in the specific to afford a house, maybe with some furniture. And the one thing I can tell for sure is economic growth in the last 40 years has reduced poverty in the world by the billions. Has it eliminated completely? No. But it has reduced by the billions. So I don't think there's anything specific about California. I've seen homeless people in the corso via Independencia under the portici. So I don't see a relation between that. The only relation I can see is that economic growth tends to reduce the number of homeless people. There are fewer homeless people in Calcutta now than when we were there 10 years ago. Sure. Please.
I think that we were first to put that this regulation, which makes it impossible to build skyscrapers. Well, in many areas, you can only build single houses, and that's why prices of houses have skyrocketed. There are many
I'm fascinated by the fact that you are so well informed about California. I have a son who's an architect living in Los Angeles and building houses and campuses, in fact. I think the problem is slightly more complex than that. Let's put it that way. I think the problem both in California and elsewhere is slightly more complex than that. And trust me, there's a lot of skyscrapers in Los Angeles. A lot. More than in Bologna. Amazing. There's also a little bit more people in Los Angeles County. I think there are about 19 million. Other questions? You mind to stand up so the people can hear?
That model was so the starting point to economic growth as a developing
Yes, so there are two parts to this. One is with respect to the specific model by Philippe and Allwit. And the other is about the notion of creative distraction. Creative distraction is this fashionable, sexy phrase that comes from Schumpeter that pointed out what we said before. In the 1911 book, he said, look around. The way it works is not that you accumulate. The way it works is some of us do things differently. And because they do things differently, when they manage to do them better, they replace people that do worse. And that makes all of us better off, even those that fail due to the fact that they do worse, because eventually they catch up, they imitate, and they get better income, higher income. That's his point, okay? Obviously, there are the homeless also in the middle, but there is, I think, very little doubt that the overall trend, even over the century, since when Schumpeter was writing, is incredibly positive. There is no comparison whatsoever between the standard of living of the average person today and the standard of living of the average person in 1911. So creative distraction per se can be written in very many ways. It's this competitive process. Basically, the competitive process of innovation is creative distraction, including you opening a restaurant, you know, the Das Pizza, what's the new one? Right. Or opening the kebab that everybody hates, that obviously displays other bars, right? That's innovation, that's economic innovation. People hate them. Well, it's creative destruction. That's what it is. In the specific, the model that you have in mind, 1992 Econometrica, Peter Howitt and Philippe Aghion, is a model that makes a claim which I think is factually incorrect, because it says growth comes through a sequence of companies, basically, or monopolists, leapfrogging each other. So for those of you who are not familiar, the two authors tell this story. Today, there is a monopolist. He controls, or she controls, whatever you find appropriate, the market because she has a patent. It's actually a symphony to patents, which is why I don't like it at all, because I think all the evidence shows the opposite. This will take me my past research and completely different track. And given that you have Levine in Florence, bring him in. Is more fun than me to talk about that. But anyhow, the point of Philippe and Peter is the monopolist makes a lot of money because he's a monopolist. All these guys are sitting behind the monopolist and hate him. And they're all scratching and working very hard, trying to find an innovation that beats him. So one of them will get the, the patent. And they're motivated by the dream of becoming monopolists, and after having found a new good and receiving the patent. When they succeed, they jump in front, okay? They eliminate, therefore, the old monopolist. She goes back to the crowd that is trying to innovate, and there is a new monopolist for a period. And the growth is this process of one monopolist after the other. To me, the question is, can you point out to one industry in which you have seen a similar process in the last century? I haven't. I don't know a single industry in which there is a sequence of monopolists leapfrogging each other. I see lots of competition. I see a lot of imitation. I see Samsung trying to catch up with Apple and LG and Google coming up with Pixel, and Motorola go bust and Nokia go bust, and then coming back and so on and so forth. But I don't see this, you know, and where instead, for whatever system of patents and other things, I see a monopolist or an almost monopolist establishing itself, Windows, I don't see anybody leapfrogging, and I see very little innovation. In fact, if Windows has managed in recent years to become a bit better of the monster it used to be, when I first was forced to go from Unix to Windows, it's because Google was catching up a bit and putting pressure with Google Drive and therefore forcing them to improve. But Excel is still the crappy thing that it was 40 years ago, and MS Word is still MS Word. So yeah, that's a good point, but I think that the paper is very elegant, very nice, but I'm afraid it doesn't really describe any experience of growth that I have in mind. Please. I'm not sure I understood what you said. Apart from well, first of all, we're not, well, depending. Different countries are in different situations, right? So we're not, yeah, you probably have England in mind. Ah, okay. So you have the UK situation in mind. I don't think I have an answer to that. I don't know but you see, that's the point. Matteo Cervellati before said, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that there is no bottom line. I don't have a salvific message. So I'm certainly the most inappropriate, inadequate person to tell you what can be done in the UK to fix whatever problems they have. I think they have very many problems, but Boudrin is not the one that will. If I had it, I would call up the Prime Minister and say, do you need a consultant? At the appropriate amount of money per hour, I'm available. No, I don't honestly know. It's certainly startling to see the shift in policy from super Keynesian policy. By the way, nobody has noticed in the press that what was her name? Truss, whatever. I mean, she lasted so little that I couldn't learn her last name. Nobody noticed that this policy was pure Keynesian policy. Good old Keynes, correctly, explained that there are two ways, perfectly symmetric, and you got use a bit of both to increase aggregate demand. One is to raise public expenditure, and she was, because she was promising a lot of subsidies for the electricity. And the other is to cut taxes, and God, if she was. So that was pure Keynesianism carried out at its extreme. The market said, not really. And she went bust. Okay, now is successfully doing the opposite. We will see. If I understand anything of the UK economy, I'm afraid that pure combination of taxes, either increasing or decreasing, and spending is not going to do it. But as I said, if I had a solution, I would call the Prime Minister and offer my services. You have to stand up because we're far away and I can't hear you. And I'm an old man. But
why we are always focused on growth and not on the optimization?
Not on optimization. Well, that's a good point. So first of all, the two things are actually not so separate, right? Optimization is all relative, it's context dependent. What's optimal depends on the objective and depends on the tools available, right? And so let's say growth is an objective. One could say, well, people like growth, and then we have to do it optimally. So it's not that thinking about economic growth precludes thinking about optimization. I think actually it involves, right? No, but you always optimize something. I think a moment. I mean, you don't optimize in general. You optimize an objective function. And that's where, again, the gustibus non disputandum est. Right? That's why before I said Italians want to go back to the 60s and have the fresh salami in the terrace. Fine. That's the gustibus. I'm not, at this point, after 40 years of public life in Italy, even if I kept doing it from abroad, I have given up on the tentative of convincing the average Italian that maybe a little bit of change could do. So I take their objective as given, which is let's remain a traditional society with all, but at least let's do it right. And so that's your point about optimization. So I don't think, honestly, that neither intellectually, nor politically, nor ethically, nor philosophically, there is an opposition. Now, a more interesting question is, why is it that in modern societies, we're all concerned about growth, and in 1500, they were not? And I think it's a perfect example of the famous story about Adam and Eve. We ate from the apple. We ate the apple from the tree. It tastes so good that we can't do without it. No, I'm serious about it. I think that have you ever read Polanyi, The Great Transformation? It's a dangerous book, very dangerous, because it tends to suggest that the old days before the terrible thing called capitalism were fantastic and everybody was happy and so on. And it's all false. Most people were slaves. They were dying at 40. Their teeth were broken. They were living in shit. Literally in shit. Life was miserable. They were starving. They had all kinds of diseases. Women were beaten up and treated like slaves. I mean, it was a disaster, in fact, from our standard, right? But it's true that the humans didn't think about growth. They thought about survival. That was already enough. Okay? And somehow, in different places, in different ways, cities in the country now called Italy contributed a lot to that between 1200, 1100 and 1500. Then the torch was passed and went north. And knew a different approach to doing things and living came around, and people tasted growth. And I think people like growth a lot. Very honestly, I think people like growth a lot. People like a lot to have the ability to do what we're doing now, which seems to be utterly boring because of me, and I'm sorry. But we like this better than working in the field under the water. I grew up as a farmer. My father was a farmer. I was working in the field at 6. And it wasn't nice. I hate the hell out of it. And I said, and I work in the factory, and I said, shit, this is horrible. I want to do everything I can to never go back to the factory. I think that that's why people like growth. For the same reason I like it better what I do now than what I was doing at 6. Zappa is not good. I think we're done. Thanks. You've been very kind and very faithful.